How's everybody doing? Yeah, everyone's feeling rightfully indignant about having to work on Labor Day. I don't know if anyone else is a fan of George the cat on Twitter. I feel like he would have something to say about this. If you're not familiar with George the cat, he is a cat that got famous through a really funny internet story, and now is one of the biggest pro-union people on Twitter. So George is all about organizing. If you don't know the story, look it up. Someone buttered jorts. It's a great, great story. All right, so today we are going to do the last question that we didn't get to on Friday. And then we're going to start our assessment lecture to talk about how we assess personality. So bringing us back to thinking about the assignment on Friday. So according to Pickren, how have Black psychologists been influential both within psychology and in society as a whole when addressing social issues? And so this was from the Liberating History article. And anyone from any group can answer. Yeah.
Oh, I don't have my.
Oh, perfect. Go for it.
It was like, I forgot the person's name. It was Amy and her husband.
Oh, maybe it's Clark and Kenneth Clark. Yeah.
They both, didn't they run the doll study that led to this, the Brown versus Board being overturned?
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with their doll study, they gave Black children either white dolls or black dolls. And they, well, actually, no, they put out both. I'm trying to remember the methodology. And they asked Black children which doll is prettier, which doll is smarter. And the Black kids kept pointing to the white doll for all the positive things. And so they wrote up what's called an Amicus Brief, where you sort of submit this as information to a Supreme Court case. And this was a big part, it was like mentioned in the justice's decision, saying essentially it's clear that separate is not equal, that putting kids in these separate schools is not actually, like, it's clear that there is a racial bias going on and kids are picking up on it, right? Yeah, I love that. I love that you mentioned Mamie first. So oftentimes people will just attribute this to Kenneth. And Kenneth Clark is great. Kenneth Clark was the first Black president of the APA, huge name in, especially racial issues research. But his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark, was the developmental person. She was the one who knew about doing research with kiddos, right? So it really was a collaboration between the two of them. And because of how women in general and non-binary people are treated in history in general, not just the history of psychology, but people often forget to mention Mamie. So I love that you mentioned her first. That's awesome. Other things that you remember from this article? Yeah, go ahead.
So you have Albert Beckham graduated from NYU, and then he went to teach at Howard University, and then he funded, I guess not funded, but founded the first counseling center for the school. And then you have Herman Kennedy, who was the predecessor to the first African American to receive a PhD in psychology. He helped to bring the light that education was lacking for African Americans because of funding and treatment, so both races could not be compared through testing.
Yeah. Spot on, perfect. Yeah, so like not only are people of color being psychologists, and in particular in the US, Black folks becoming psychologists, right, given our history, important to psychology as a field, but oftentimes their studies are leading to change, or they are going out and making the change themselves, like having the first counseling center at Howard, right? Huge thing. And if you're not familiar with Howard, it's one of the HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Like the HBCU, honestly, it's probably one of the highest ranked. And so they are, and this is something that's really interesting. So there's a movement within psychology right now called liberation psychology, which is why this article was titled Liberating Psychology. And the idea is that we should use our scientific knowledge to benefit communities, and particularly people who came from impoverished communities. You know, I'm trying to say this in a nice, tactful way, but I don't know if I can. Essentially, the idea often is within impoverished communities, like, oh, you got to Howard, you got to Harvard, you need to go out and make a big game for yourself, right? Go somewhere else and do something big. And a lot of those folks are saying, no, I'm going back to my community and I'm going to benefit them, which I think is really important. So there's a big movement within research, if I think about the research stuff we were talking about last week, to not just do research on people, but do research with people in the community. So bring in members of the community to help you design the study, to help you recruit participants. And not only that, but then to help you implement any changes that are suggested as a result of your findings. So really important stuff. It's really important that we not forget these folks exist, even though, again, unfortunately, that is the case in some places. All right, so you get the vibe for what those discussion days will be like. I think just based on my observations from last week, what I will do from now on is bring in paper versions, just because I think it's a lot easier to talk if like someone has to actually be the scribe and you have to like look over their shoulder to see the question. So from now on, I'll do that. This out of our way and turn on these captions because they are a little better. Alrighty, go ahead and minimize Brecken and I. Okay. Alrighty. So this is one of my favorite aspects of personality psychology assessment. And it's basically the applied portion of the study of personality. So this is where personality comes into the therapy room, comes into the courtroom sometimes. It's where you are taking this nomothetical understanding we have about personality and its related dysfunctions and bringing it to the person sitting across from you as a psychologist. And some of this will be in this lecture, but just to give you all a little history of why I in particular get really excited about assessment. So admittedly, bless you, before I got to grad school, I don't even think I technically knew what assessment meant. Like we hadn't discussed it in this formal way in my undergraduate education. But I just happened to end up at Kent State University, which is consistently ranked in the top 3 clinical psych programs in the country for assessment research. And that also meant we got extensive assessment training. And I love it. It's like a puzzle. It's like you are Sherlock Holmes and you're trying to figure out this person in front of you and how you can best help them. And you get all these different pieces of information and you get to put them together. And the personality assessments are often the most interesting component of that. So we're gonna spend a few days talking about that. So what is assessment? It is collecting relevant information in an effort to reach a conclusion. And again, depending on the setting, that conclusion might be different. So it might be, this is the diagnosis the person has, and that means I can help them XYZ way. It might be, this person is in front of me for a legal question. And by doing this assessment, I can determine whether or not they might have been, incompetent at the time or insane at the time of the crime. But it can also be smaller questions of how can this one little aspect of what's going on in this person's life be negatively affecting what goes on with them. And so here's where we're bringing back the idea of idiographic versus nomothetic information. Again, remember, idiographic, I, individual, is about the client. It is the person sitting in the room with you. What's going on with them in particular. Nomothetic information is more general information about personality, its nature, its causes. So what we learn in this class is really nomothetic information. And then once you would be sitting, and some of you, I know your future careers will be in clinical counseling, sitting in the room with that client, that's where you take that nomothetic information and use it to come up with idiographic information that will help you in that client. So clinical assessment in particular is collecting information to determine how and why that person is having problems. And again, here we're thinking about disordered personality, but based on how a lot of theorists have conceptualized personality and its dysfunction, what we end up talking about here is abnormality in general, psychopathology in general. So, this person, not only might they have a personality disorder, but do they have depression, anxiety, those types of things. So this really is the clinical portion of personality psychology. So we're trying to figure out what disorder they might have, if any, and then based on that, what can be done to help them. Standardization is a really important piece of clinical assessment. And so where the Zoom captions are floating right now, there we go. This is a picture of someone administering an intelligence scale. And these have very regimented instructions down to like how far away from the client you're supposed to place the materials and exact instructions you read. And the same is true of many of the different types of assessments we'll talk about, where there are standard instructions you read when you give someone a big inventory, even if you're going to leave the room while they fill it out. And so the idea is I could give this, my friend who works in San Diego could give this, my friend who works in rural Georgia could give this assessment, and we should get the same results because we've given the same instructions. Now, especially since we just talked about sort of racial things, caveat here, we know that there are sort of assessor-client interactions, and that particularly if you're doing something like an intelligence test, kids are likely to do better, or people in general, if the examiner is more like this. So if you've got a young girl of color and a white man giving her the test, she might do less well than if a woman of color was giving it to her. But we try to make it as standard as possible to try and rule as much of that out as we can. Because we want to be accurate, right? We want to benefit the client and not be getting information that's a waste of the client's time and ours. And one of the things that we're going to look at with assessment instruments because of this is what are called the psychometrics. And these are the reliability and validity. And those of you who took assessment with me last year, these terms will sound very familiar. So reliability is the consistency of measurement. So there are a bunch of different types of reliability, and any assessment we give, we want it to have good reliability. Inter-rater reliability refers to the degree of agreement between two observers. So let's say we have kiddos come in and we're observing whether they might have some sort of social disorder, whether it's social anxiety, I don't even know if we want to call it a disorder, but they're neurodivergent, and so they interact socially in a different way than neurotypical people do, right? You might have two different people either watching through one of those one-way mirrors, or you videotape it and you watch it later, and they're rating their social activities. Inter-rater reliability says those two people should be pretty highly correlated in how they're rating things. Test-retest reliability refers to the extent in which scores are similar for the same person being observed twice taking the same test. So I give this to you now, and then I give it to you in 2 weeks. Should you score pretty similarly? Now, this is really interesting once we get into personality and some of these symptoms. Things like personality traits, things like the big five that we'll talk about later in the semester, yeah, we do want good test retest reliability, because personality traits are supposed to be something that doesn't really change throughout your life. Let's say we have a measure of depression though, and we're doing therapy with someone, and we test them now and we test them in 8 weeks. Well, we don't want predictive rater reliability, right? We really hope that if we've been doing therapy with someone for 8 weeks, their depression symptoms will have lessened, right? And so like, that's just to show that not all of these things are things we want for every instrument, right? But we always want to think about reliability in general. And one of the things that we almost always look at, particularly for giving some sort of questionnaire, you read a bunch of items. Those of you who have participated in psych studies before, this is a lot of what you do, right? You're just kind of filling in bubbles on SurveyMonkey, or maybe if you're doing it in person, you're filling out on paper. And that's internal consistency. So whether all those items that you're going through and answering are actually measuring the same thing. Are they all related to each other? If I'm giving a measure of depression, you know, internal consistency would be items like, I have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. I'm very tired. I lack energy. I'm feeling depressed or down. But then if I throw in something like, I like chocolate ice cream, right? Like, that's nice. That probably doesn't have anything to do with your depression, right? So making sure you get those items. And that's obviously a silly example, but in psychology, sometimes this is tough, right? So like, if I'm asking about being agitated, well, for a rare group of people, that could be a symptom of depression, but more often it's actually a symptom of anxiety, right? So there are ways that statistically we can determine which items best help us answer the question, is this person feeling depressed? I don't even know if anyone gets this reference anymore, but I use the original American Idol judges as an example of poor inter-rater reliability. So the original American Idol judges were Randy Jackson, Simon Cowell, and Paula Abdul. And Randy Jackson, for pretty much every person, was like, yo, dog, that's kind of pitchy, dog. I don't know. And then Simon Cowell will be like, that was horrible. And Paula Abdul would just be like, that was wonderful, and you look so pretty. I've lost my actual impressions of them. I just realized I used to be much better at that. But horrible interrelater reliability, right? You would hope that raters who just watched the same person sing would have similar comments. All right, so that's consistency. That's reliability. Validity is the accuracy. Does it actually measure what it says it's measuring? Is it fulfilling its intended purpose? So I could have a beautifully consistent measure, and I'm saying this is a measure of depression, and then you look at it and you're like, no, you're just measuring how much someone likes chocolate ice cream, right? All these questions about chocolate ice cream. So yeah, they're consistent, but this has nothing to do with depression. So there are different types of validity. And again, we don't necessarily want all of these for every measure that we create or use. So face validity is, does it look like it measures what it's supposed to be measuring? And there are questionnaires where you want this to be the case. But in personality assessment, often we kind of don't care about face validity. One of the questionnaires we're going to talk about is the MMPI. And the original creator, one of the two original creators of the MMPI, used to kind of brag he had never read the items. He didn't care what they were asking as long as they measured what they were supposed to be measuring. Again, the Rorschach, which we're wearing the dress for today, that doesn't look like it's assessing anything, right? They just look like blobs. But in fact, we can get some good information from it. Predictive validity is, can it predict what will happen in the future? So something like treatment outcome, some of the larger personality inventories we'll talk about have subscales that look at how well will this person do in therapy, right? Will therapy be helpful to them? We want those to be pretty darn accurate, right? Concurrent validity is the degree to which, let's say, again, I'm trying to measure depression. So I give people the gold standard, the Beck Depression Inventory, and then I give them this new chocolate ice cream depression inventory. I'm just going to keep using this stupid example. Concurrent validity, if I have them both fill them out at the same time, they should correlate pretty highly. Obviously, those two probably not going to. But if I create a new measure that actually measures depression, those scores should be related to existing measures of depression, right? And the difference between predictive and concurrent is just time. So predictive looks at 2 different time points, concurrent looks at right now. Content validity refers to whether the measure is adequately getting everything that's part of that construct. Does it measure all potential aspects of the topic? Is it adequately sampling the domain of interest? So again, if I'm measuring something like depression, and I'm only asking about depressed mood, I'm going to be missing some of the physiological things we know are really important parts of a diagnosis of depression. Things like loss of appetite, things like difficulty sleeping, things like having trouble getting up and doing things, right? So content validity is making sure we're getting all aspects of that idea in there. And then construct validity refers to whether a measure of a construct is actually supported by other measures of the construct. So if I compare it to something like the Beck Depression Inventory or a clinical interview about depression, does it actually correlate with those existing measures in some meaningful way? If not, we want to question, are we actually measuring depression? Again, we may have created a really cool new questionnaire, but it just might not be measuring what we think it's measuring. One example of this that I can tell you all is in the MMPI, which I'll reference a lot because that's what we really used a lot when I was in grad school. They sort of reanalyzed the items a few years ago. That's not a few years ago. This was when I was in grad school. So in the aughts, about 10 years ago. And what they found is that like what they thought was measuring depression was actually measuring just like the absence of positive emotions. And that's really highly related to depression, right? But it's not depression in the same way, right? And so we might have to sometimes like rename what a questionnaire is getting at. All right. So if, again, you've got this person sitting across from you, you as a therapist, or just as someone who's assessing them for some reason, are going to be trying to figure out what's going on with them, the most important thing, what everyone is going to do is an interview. You're going to gather information about their lives and circumstances. And again, depending on the situation, what you ask and how you ask it may differ a little bit. But the most common one that I would say almost all therapists are going to use on the initial session is what's called an unstructured interview. This is a lot of open-ended questions. Tell me what brought you in today. Tell me about your previous psychiatric history. This is a way of gathering a lot of information and observing any nonverbal indicators of what might be bothering them. So for example, when you ask about certain topics, do they, all of a sudden their leg starts bouncing or they hug themselves, right? Things like that can really be good indicators. Or just which questions do they avoid answering? Every time you're asking a client about something related to substance use, they change the subject, right? That tells you, I'm probably gonna want to circle back around to that, see what's going on there. So that is an unstructured interview. So these are some other examples of unstructured questions. What was it like growing up in your family? I like how that one's phrased because it's very non-judgmental, right? Because you could say it was great, it was fantastic, or you could go into, oh, it was awful for all these reasons. Do you feel that people are there for you when you need them? This can be very telling as to how someone views the world around them, right? You can get a lot of like paranoia from something like that. Alrighty. And then you have structured interviews. So these will be used in more formal settings. If you have the advantage of being in a place that has the money to like get the supplies for these are often expensive, produced by testing companies, you have to pay for each one, yada, yada, yada. If you have the luxury of time, these are fantastic. So what do I mean by the luxury of time? Well, when you are in a managed care setting, that means a setting where you're taking insurance. You have to have a diagnosis on the paperwork in order to get reimbursed for any treatment you get. So that means if you don't have a diagnosis by the end of your first meeting with the client's either going to have to pay out of pocket or like you're just not getting paid as a therapist, right? Which is not ideal. Therapists also need to pay rent and eat and all that good stuff, right? And so you often don't have the luxury of the additional time it requires to do a structured interview. When I was working in a managed care setting on my internship year, my residency year, we had an hour to do an intake. And at the end of that hour, not only did I have to have a diagnosis, but because of the way the law in Georgia works, which is where I did my internship, we actually had to call our supervisor, have them come down, discuss the diagnosis with them, have our supervisor come in with us to meet the client while we gave the diagnosis to the client. When I was in grad school and we were in our training clinic, we're not collecting any kind of money, services were free, we don't have that pressure. And also when I was at the VA, where payment and reimbursement is often very different, particularly if you're service connected. So what that means is they say you are disabled because of this, right? So if you're service connected for PTSD, means that the VA is just going to pay for all your care related to PTSD. In those cases, in those types of settings, you have much more freedom to do these structured interviews. The other place you do these is in research settings. This is one of the reasons why we did this in our psychological training clinic, is because this was a research study that they were doing. I wish that everyone who was a therapist got to give these because they're just so helpful. And in fact, when I was doing the managed care setting, I essentially kind of did my own small version of a structured interview for the primary symptoms of the disorders I saw most often, because I wanted to make sure I was getting the diagnosis right. So in a structured interview, you're going to ask the client specifically about the symptoms they are experiencing. The format of the questions is highly standardized, and the person answers the questions are scored according to concrete criteria. So often it's sort of like a yes, no, things along those lines. And so this does have a different vibe. This is a drawback of structured interviews, is that, unstructured interviews really just sort of feel like a conversation. Structured interviews end up feeling very regimented. And so I would often tell my clients, like, all right, next I'm going to ask you a set of standardized questions. I have to ask them in a very specific way. So it's going to feel a little different, but bear with me. This really helps me figure out what's going on with you. So the most common one that's given is the SCID, the Structured Clinical Interview for the DSM. I learned on the DSM-4 version. We are now on DSM-5, so I'm sure there's a SCID 5. And this basically what the SCID does is take the criteria for each disorder from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and make them questions. So you're essentially asking people, do you have this symptom, yes or no? So like the first question you ask on the SCID pretty much is for the depression module. In the past 2 months, has there been a period of time where you're feeling depressed or down most of the day, nearly every day, for at least 2 weeks, or whatever it is? Yes, nearly every day, nearly every day. I used to have that much better memorized because I'd ask every client I saw. Then there are follow-up questions that you probe further about the details. There are also specific structured questionnaires for particular diagnoses. The SCID kind of covers all diagnoses, but there are specific ones. So at the VA, we would give the CAPS, or the Clinician Administered PTSD Scale, because I was working on the PTSD unit. So we sort of assumed people coming in probably had PTSD. And so this asks very specifically about symptoms of PTSD, but then also about their frequency and intensity. So have you ever had unwanted memories of whatever their traumatic event was? What were they like? What did you remember? So in addition to sort of a yes, no on that, you would then ask, how often have you had these memories? And then you either do it like within the past month or the past week, whatever you're trying to get down to. And the answers they give are either never, once or twice a week, several times a week, daily, or almost daily. So this is telling you how often these symptoms are occurring. Then there's the intensity. How much distress or discomfort did these memories cause you? Were you able to put them out of your mind and think about something else? How hard did you have to try? How much did they interfere with your life? You're trying to get at, are these symptoms causing clinical significance? Are they actually disrupting this person's life? So again, here, none. Mild, so that'd be minimal distress or disruption. Moderate, distress is clearly present, but still manageable. Severe, considerable distress, difficulty discussing memories, marked disruption of activities. Or extreme, incapacitating distress, cannot dismiss memories, unable to continue activities. And again, there's a question for each symptom of PTSD, and you go through all these components for each symptom of PTSD. Again, it's great. It gives you a really nice picture of what's going on with them. But unless you're at a place like the VA, it can be difficult to do something like this when you need to, have that diagnosis really quickly. Another thing you might do during a clinical interview is a mental status exam. A lot of times you're doing this informally. So what does that mean? Well, if the person shows up to your office on time, he seems to be pretty well put together, able to speak pretty clearly and answer your questions, you could generally say this person is doing all right in terms of mental status. But particularly where there are questions about whether this person might be having memory problems, attention problems, dementia, things along those lines, you might formally ask these questions. So you're systematically evaluating things like awareness, orientation to person, time, place, situation, attention span, memory, judgment, mood, and again, even appearance. So some sample questions here. What is today's date? What city and state are we in? What building are we in? What floor? And so these would allow you to determine, how is this person doing? Do we need to do additional assessment to see what's going on with them neuropsychologically? There are several limitations of interviews in general. One is that they may lack validity because sometimes people don't report accurately or they just can't report accurately, right? Coming off our mental status exam, if this person is having memory issues, be it dementia, be it amnesia, and you ask them about their past, they might not be able to answer those, right? Or sometimes there's stuff psychologically going on to where they've kind of squished that down in the back of their head, what Freud would call repression, and they just can't access that information. I'll give you an example since we've just been talking about PTSD. I had a client I saw while I was on residency who came in to deal with symptoms of PTSD. And, in the intake, as I was talking to her about it, she relayed an incident where she was sexually assaulted as a teenager, got pregnant, and gave the baby up for adoption. And then part of what you do in therapy for PTSD is you have them write out what happened. The idea is that we often avoid thinking about horrible things, and that can give us that can give it extra power over us, right? And so by facing it and thinking about it, that gives us power back over it. And she came in and started reading her account, and it was about being gang raped when she was 12. And I stopped her and I said, whoa, this is not what you talked about before. And she said, I've never told anyone about this before. She was in her 40s. And she said, I had basically forgotten this happened until I tried to write about the other incident, and this is what kept coming up. So obviously we switched the focus of therapy then, right? But she literally could not remember that had happened to her. And that is our brain actually does that to try to protect us. Our brain puts things in place to make us forget things like that. And we can explain that neurochemically. But yeah, again, she doesn't intentionally trying to deceive me or anything, right? It's just she didn't have access to that information. And sometimes people just lack insight into what's going on with them as well. Second, okay, go ahead.
Is this considered flashbulb?
Oh, good question. No. So a flashbulb memory is actually when there's a huge traumatic event that may or may not even affect you. I don't want to say it doesn't affect you, but it's sort of a national or international importance. And then what flashbulb memory is you remember where and when you were when you found out about it. So for my parents' generation, it is JFK being assassinated. For my grandparents' generation, it's the bombing of Pearl Harbor. For my generation, it's September 11th. I don't know if y'all have one. Some people have said Sandy Hook. Some people have said the start of the pandemic, right? I kind of remember everything that was happening the day we found out we were shutting down in March 2020.
I still remember.
Do you? Okay, so yeah, some people still 9/11 stands out. I'm getting to the point where some of my students they weren't even born when 9/11 happened. That makes me feel old because I was in college. But yeah, it's just and the interesting, this is a sidebar, but flashbulb memories are actually not as accurate as we think they are, partially because we retell them. It's kind of like a fish story, that every time you retell it, the fish gets bigger, right? So if we add by telling a memory, by pulling it out of our memory, we often alter it. But in my opinion, mine is accurate. I'm sure it's not. But for 9/11, I remember very clearly finding out about it. This is again gonna date me. AOL Instant Messenger was the thing. It's texting wasn't really the thing yet. And one of my friends had texted IMB, plane hits the World Trade Center. And I was like, oh, what a horrible accident, right? Because in your mind, you're not computing, this could be a terrorist attack, because we hadn't really experienced that in that way. And I remember sort of a lot of the things I did throughout the day that day. Again, probably not accurate, but just that moment of finding out is supposed to be sort of crystal clear in our memory. But yeah, in terms of the traumatic events, oftentimes what happens is essentially our brain just kind of keeping them out of our memory. And then when they come back up, it's just sort of, sometimes it's a flashback, right? Where flashback, they feel like they're actually back in the moment of it happening, or sometimes it's just a very vivid memory. But yeah, excellent question. Yeah, flashbulb memories are sort of an interesting byproduct of big tragedies, because it's everyone's kind of where were you when you heard, right? And so we all have that story. Another thing we have to be really careful about is interviewer bias. Depending on who's interviewing, they might look more or less into symptoms, particularly in an unstructured interview. Totally guilty of this myself when I was seeing clients. I would always ask about their eating, right? Even if they're not coming to me for an eating disorder, do you ever use food as a coping mechanism? And a lot of my depressed clients would, right? And it's not necessarily I'm going to treat them for an eating disorder, but it's something I'm going to keep in the back of my mind that's like, let's find you other coping mechanisms rather than binge eating, for example. But this can also be really problematic. So I do not know why. He's got to be retired by now. But when I was on my placement year in grad school, I worked at a hospital where the psychiatrist across the hall did not believe that major depressive disorder was a thing. He thought anyone who had depression was bipolar and they just hadn't had a manic episode yet. This is not a thing, not surprisingly, right? And so he would never diagnose someone with just depression. He would always diagnose them as bipolar. That's problematic, right? That's inaccurate. But again, sometimes this would just be not following up on something because you don't think to follow up on it, and could be problematic. And then these might also lack reliability because people respond differently to different interviewers, right? Sometimes someone is going to clearly ask for an interviewer that they want to vibe with, and sometimes you don't have that privilege, right? So I remember so in our training clinic, we were all considered within the same web of confidentiality so that we could learn from each other's cases. We would not go like blabbing it around campus, but we could talk to each other about other cases. And there was a young man who came in and requested a male therapist. And I happened to be in the clinic with our clinic director. And so after, the young man had left, we asked the therapist, like, what's going on? Why did he want a guy? And it turned out this client's issue was a impulse control disorder where he was masturbating 6 hours a day, right? Like that sounds like physically potentially damaging, right? And so he just didn't feel comfortable talking to, we were all pretty young females about it, right? So yeah, if he had had one of us, if he hadn't had the ability to see Brad, right? He might not have opened up about why he was really there. Alrighty, so now we're going to start talking about the different types of assessments or tests that we do. There's a lot of different subcategories, and we'll talk about each of these in a lot more detail. And for personality, in general, we're looking at the top 3. But as part of a more comprehensive battery, we might include all of these. And so that's why I talk about those as well. So again, projectives, got my Rorschach dress on. In projectives, the participant is presented vague stimuli or asked to follow really open-ended directions. And the idea on this is based in Freudian theory, is that because they are so vague, subjects will then, or participants or clients will then project their personality onto whatever the stimulus is. So it's mostly used by psychodynamic clinicians to try to assess unconscious drives and conflicts. And it's really important to note here that the validity of projective tests have been repeatedly called into question because they are so subjective and in theory can be rated however the interviewer chooses. There are, however, standardized scoring systems that have been developed that are trying to combat this and trying to account for this. And I forgot to give you all a definition, which is the definition of a psychological test, which is a device for gathering information. A device for gathering information. And in particular in psychology, we're looking at the person's psychological functioning, and here we're going to be looking at their personality. And then we can infer broader information based on that. All right, so the Rorschach. So the Rorschach is the most famous of these, and it consists of a series of ink blots. And individuals are asked, what might this be? Or some other methods of scoring might ask you, tell me what you see. And the information is inferred based on comments about things like color, where in the blot they see it, if they're using texture, if they're using shading, if they're using the negative space, things along those lines. The Rorschach was actually developed based on a parlor game called Blotto, where people would just take ink. This was back when you had like ink wells and pens, fountain pens, drip the ink on the paper, fold it in half, and open it up. And it's kind of like when kids lay on their back and look at clouds, right? Oh, I see an elephant. Oh, I see this. And then someone decided, oh, this might be a nice way to look at things psychologically. Well, we knew who that someone is. His name was Herman Rorschach. And you might be thinking, why am I showing you this? Why are the blots, which actually cost $75 to buy, on my dress, which is commercially produced by a small company? Here is the fun part. I might not, the link didn't transfer over, but that's okay. It's real easy to show you because if I go to, I gotta say test because otherwise it's going to give me the character. If I go to Wikipedia about the Rorschach and I scroll down, they have all 10 blots published, along with common responses. This is really problematic. And when this first happened in the aughts, people really tried hard to get this taken down again, not only because you're supposed to pay to get these ink blots, but also for what we call test security. So typically it's not only like a good idea, but also an ethical obligation of practicing psychologists to protect testing, to try to make, when someone comes in, it's the first time they're seeing material, so it's their fraction is genuine, right? And spontaneous. But like, because you guys could just go to Wikipedia and see these, like, I don't feel unethical showing you them, if that makes sense. But yeah, so these are the actual original Rorschach blots. And as you can see, some are just black and white, some have some red on them, and then some have some really nice coloration on them as well. So yeah, very interesting. And sort of I don't know how the company hasn't gotten them taken down. I don't know. Just, sometimes things are not fixable in this digital age. So, and at this point, they're out there, right? So, but to tell you more about the actual Rorschach, in this, you are supposed to be, again, they're supposed to be projecting their personality onto these blots. And there are standardized scoring methods, as I mentioned. So the one I'm trained in is the most commonly used, and that's called the Exner System. And when I learned to do the Exner System, it was like a 2.5-day workshop where we just talked about Rorschach all day. Woohoo! And I've only ever given 2 in my life. But I do have to say, as skeptical as I was when I was learning about it, I just sort of learned it because it makes you more marketable, essentially, if you know how to give it. But those 2 people I gave it to, it gave me insights I did not get from other assessment instruments. So for example, my favorite case that I gave this to was a woman who was inpatient hospitalized. She was running out of insurance money. The doctors were sort of like, she seems like she's okay, but she keeps on saying, no, she needs to stay here. So after giving her the Rorschach, what I discovered is there was sort of this hesitancy, this what we sometimes call faking bad, where someone might be exaggerating their symptoms. And so there is something you can do while you give people their results that's called Therapeutic Assessment. And so I presented her results to her and I said, well, what do you think about this? And she ended up saying, yeah, she didn't want to go home because her relationship with her husband was not great. It wasn't abusive, but they just fought all the time. And she thought it would be detrimental to her mental health. Nothing else I gave her, all the structured stuff, gave me that information. right? So I got really important information from it. Alrighty, we will end there for today. And we will pick up talking more about projectives on Wednesday.